Welcome to Keep Talking, a community dialogue about mental health. My name is Gay Maxwell, and I run the continuing education program at the Brattleboro Retreat. Keep Talking is brought to you by the Brattleboro Retreat in cooperation with Brattleboro Area Television. And I have in the studio with us today a special guest, Dr. Jennifer Tanner, who's visiting us in order to do a presentation for the Office of Continuing Education tomorrow. She'll be presenting, her topic is helping emerging adults make transitions in the 21st century. She will be speaking to a crowd of almost 70 mental health professionals from all over New England, talking about this subject. And I asked her if she would be willing to come and be interviewed on Keep Talking, and she very graciously agreed to do that. Welcome, Dr. Tanner.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm really thrilled that you are here. I wanted to talk a little bit about you. I know that you are a developmental psychologist, that you're also a certified family life educator. Mm-hmm. You're an assistant research professor at the moment at Rutgers University, mm-hmm. and also the vice chair of the Society for the Study of Emerging Adulthood. Right. And there have been at least two books that you've been associated with that I know about at any rate. One was being the co-editor of a book called Emerging Adults in America, mm-hmm. and also co-author of Debating Emerging Adulthood, Stage or Process. But welcome and thank you for being so gracious to give us this time today. What led to your interest in this subject? What, if you can briefly tell us about yourself in relationship to the subject of emerging adulthood?
Well, that's a good question. Why I was interested in emerging adulthood to begin with is I was one of the people to come of age in Generation X. Mm-hmm. And I came from a relatively working class background, and our family made a transition to a different community when I was an adolescent. One that there wasn't a lot of resources there, and I was an outsider. Starting in 9th grade, it takes a while to adjust, so I was an observer for a while.
A tough time to make a move
as
an adolescent.
And then I think that the upside of that is that I had an opportunity to see adolescence from a distance, rather than, adolescents tend to be very, egocentric in their thinking in the world, which is very normal. But so I spent this time being an observer of adolescence, and I saw that there were these huge expectations of people to make these transitions to adulthood. But I also saw in the community that there was not that much support for adolescents. And the adolescents felt, I think, that nobody really cared about them. There was a lot of substance use, and people were, engaging in behaviors that weren't that helpful to them for their futures. And it really struck me, even around 16, 17, that the expectations that people have on young people are very high compared to the amount of support that we give to development right before you're expected to transition. Mm-hmm. And I was one of very few kids from my high school to go to college. It was a town like that. So watching the different pathways that people took after high school really made me think about, how we perceive success in adulthood and how much it's attributed to the individual, when I really was interested in how much resources people were getting and support to get the transition to adulthood. Mm-hmm. That's really where my interest came about.
So did you study psychology at first, or you moved right into developmental psychology or sociology? What?
That's, this is an interesting story too. I went to UMass Amherst, and I really enjoyed my time there, and I was a psychology student. And really, when you're a psychology student, you don't really always understand what the pathway to being a psychologist is. You know what you want to do is to help people, but you don't really understand necessarily that it's another 5 years of school and another 2 years of training, and you get to start adulthood much later. Mm-hmm. And I was really interested in mental health, always the mental health of 18 to 25-year-olds. But I wasn't necessarily interested in the disorders. I wasn't interested in depression, and I didn't like working in the depression lab per se, and I wasn't interested in anxiety or substance disorders. And I had this very wonderful advisor, Dr. Susan Whitbourne at UMass, and she said, "You know what you are? You're a developmentalist. You care about the individual. You don't care about the disorder. You are interested that the individual develops the disorder and why. And from that insight, she really encouraged me to become a developmental psychologist, one who studies what's normal about development in order to tell us when it goes awry. So instead of studying abnormal psychology or clinical psychology, where you focus on populations that have some outcome that you consider abnormal, and you work to get rid of the abnormal behavior or thinking or pattern, instead of that, you focus on the individual and how to get them on a normal course of development. And your assumptions are different. Your assumptions that everybody has a potential for a normal pathway, and that psychopathology or mental health is just a deviation off of that path that can be encouraged to go back on a normal path.
So I gather there is a growing consensus that we as a culture need to look at this developmental stage, which is only being lately defined as emerging adulthood. And so that's and you say in an article, I did do some homework, by the way. I read a chapter by you in the Handbook of Youth and Young Adulthood. And what you say in that article is that emerging adulthood is a critical juncture in human development. So it's not adolescence, it's not adulthood. Would you explain what it is?
Sure. So there's two different ways of thinking about how lives are structured. Most people agree that people go through different stages of life and development. Sociologists tend to believe that our individual lives are very much shaped by what society tells us we should do at each stage. So obviously it tells us what infancy should look like and what childhood should look like and what adolescents should be doing and then what adults should be doing. And we kind of section off midlife, and then there's older age. So those people, sociologists think about the external world and how it shapes the individual life, whereas psychologists, in particular developmental psychologists, have focused on the development of the individual from the biology, so that the individual is really shaped by the unfolding of your genetic potential. So you see this dialectic, this dynamic of why these two different social sciences exist. Outside structures of the individual versus inside structures. So the critical juncture is really that developmental processes, or the unfolding of the biological human, really tapers off between 18 and 25. The influence of genetics and biological potential is almost fully met by the age of 29. And what we mean by that is the 18 to 29-year-old is an extremely healthy age group for a species.
So you're putting emerging adulthood in between those ages, 18 to 29?
Yeah, so if we just think of age, if we just look at age and we look at the medical literature and we say, when does cardiovascular activity peak, like your health? Between ages 18 and 29, we're getting the answer back in terms of just an age range, without putting a label. I think it's when is the skeleton fully formed? 18 to 29. And when is our muscle mass greatest? 18 to 29. You see, it's that's the average, and then there's a lot of normal variation around there. It's all peak potential happening really in that decade. So you say that there's something interesting about this age.
Yes.
There's just something interesting when you don't look at society and you don't look at our social norms or expectations. There's something from the individual level that's interesting about this age period. There's some reason biologically why we're so healthy. Reproduction peaks during that. We start caring for 2 instead of 1 or 3 instead of 1. And so I began to think about age really from the perspective of a psychologist. But you can't help but realize that it's the first time where you become legally responsible for yourself and taking care of yourself. So you talk in this article also about the concept of recentering, that's something that is particularly, that's what emerging adults are, those are the tasks. Could you talk a little bit about what recentering means? Yeah, so this is this idea. I'm thinking, okay, the individual is healthy and going through this biological development, but society is also sending these signals like it is time to start taking care of yourself. And then I start thinking, what there's an intersection here that happens at no other stage of the lifespan. This is the critical juncture. This is at no other period of the lifespan does society say, hey, wake up, start taking care of yourself. And you're biologically able to. You're at your peak fitness. So that's why I call it the critical juncture. And then I started thinking, okay, that's from outside of the individual. The individual is never thinking, I'm approaching a critical juncture of the lifespan. But what is the individual doing? The individual is feeling like, whoa, my life isn't structured anymore. Nobody's telling me what to do. And now I really need to find my own way. And so from an individual perspective of what's happening in the individual, I call it recentering. This is the task that people are working on, that there is an impetus for the individual to say, hey, people used to take care of me and tell me what to do. Now I need to take care of me and tell me what to do. And that this is the normal task of growing up between age, and then we tackle this between ages 18 and 29. And then I didn't come up with the term emerging adulthood, but my colleague Jeffrey Arnett, in the year 2000, he had proposed and said, it's not just that kids are taking longer to grow into adulthood. We all agree that people are marrying later and having kids later and entering their careers later. But it was really Jeff Arnett, a professor at Clark University, who through the 90s, he started to see that all these transitions were happening later. And he was the first person to say, well, we're not just seeing a lengthening of adolescence. We're really seeing a unique life stage that for whatever reasons we didn't see before. And his carving out this as a distinct age period really gave me another way of thinking. Okay, so it's not just that there's this critical task. It's that it's a whole life stage during which there's this task.
And why do you think that developmental psychologists say in the last, I guess it's in the last 20 years or so, why did they feel that this is so important for us to recognize? How will this be helpful for us as psychologists to know, and teachers and so forth, to know that there is this unique development? How will this be useful to the emerging adult, but also to the people surrounding them?
Sure. Well, Arnett proposed the idea, and it's no small feat to change the way a whole profession thinks about how we organize the lifespan. But his introduction of this concept took off like wildfire. I think that it made a lot of sense, number one. Also, I think that people need a new way of making sense of what's going on in their lives, a cohesive organizational framework. What it is going to do, and what it has started to do, is it has started to say in people's real lives, if we have this age period and it's unique and we haven't looked at it before, how well can we possibly be understanding and meeting the needs of this age group? And so it's still in debate, frankly, in terms of an ivory tower concept. Is this a new life stage, or is this a blip in history? And it's a very valid academic debate. In people's lives, it's very rarely up for debate. People really feel like this is a distinct age period, something that's very much not like adolescence.
Could you describe the characteristics of what makes it a unique period of time? Maybe give some examples of that?
Certainly. So Arnett has 5 criteria where he describes what emerging adulthood as a life stage is like. And he said, emerging adults, they're 18 to 25-year-olds primarily. He restricts it to this period of exploration, where young people, it's relatively homogenous in what they're doing. They're unconnected to roles that are permanent. So they're not necessarily defined by their role as being someone's child anymore. They don't see that as a permanent commitment. Being a student is temporary, if that's what you're doing. The jobs that they tend to hold, they feel are very temporary. So what they're doing is they have this, we call it instability, but it's not an instability of emotions, it's an instability of connections. When you're in full adulthood, or by the time you make the threshold transition into young adulthood, you make commitments that are life lasting. You might get married, but even when you're divorced, you have a lasting commitment to that person through a marriage and a divorce, that process, linking of lives, children, obviously, connections with community. When you buy a house, or when you're part of a community through work, you have more stable commitments. So the emerging adulthood looks like this period of instability where they're moving in and out of roles, and that's normal. It's not abnormal.
So and it's very, I imagine, because I think you talk a little bit in your article about the fact that there's sort of progression, and then there's regression, and there's progression, and there's regression, and that could look in a way, it could look to the adults in that emerging adult's life as if there's a problem. Right. But you're trying to normalize that progression regression.
Yeah, and in developmental psychology, where you wouldn't necessarily see it from a clinical lens, because a clinical lens, you're kind of trained to think about an abnormality as a categorical difference, that you move from being a person who's not an adult to being an adult, somebody who has depression versus somebody who doesn't have depression, in this very categorical way. But a developmentalist understands that development happens in a non-linear way. That's the rule of development. That development happens, and I like to use this example from, when a human is 1 year of age, we all know that the progression is they learn to sit, and that's when their core strength comes online in their abdomen. And they crawl, and then they start to coordinate their movements between their brain and their body more, and their arms and their legs. And then when you put together core strength with this ability to coordinate your limbs, you have the ability to walk. And so in this way, walking is a nonlinear progression. You see it in different forms, but if you said, what does the ability to ambulate look like? What does the ability to walk look like? All those steps lead up to walking, but they don't look like they go together. They go together. And then once the little 1 year old starts to walk, everybody's had the experience where, the baby takes 2 or 3 steps and then falls and then comes back. Then the baby takes 4 or 5 steps and then falls and then comes back. And so really I liken, emerging adulthood to a very similar process. It's you go as far as you can developmentally tolerate, and then you have to come back a little bit. And then you go a little bit farther, and then you come back a little bit. And each time you're gaining a little more strength.
Are you referring to things like moving back home with your parents, getting your first apartment, maybe that doesn't work out, you move back again with your parents? Is that a valid example?
Yeah, that's a very valid example. So the goal of healthy recentering, if you look at this as the developmental task that they're working on, what's happening at the intrapsychic level in the individual's mind is that everybody has needs. Somebody has to take care of those needs. Before you're 18, there's an expectation that others are going to take care of those needs. Doesn't always happen, but that's the expectation. And the individual always has those needs. And then after 18, you start to meet your own needs. And it's really a transfer of meeting needs to the individual. So you have to look at all the things they're doing. So they're moving out and they're trying to gain financial responsibility. Well, moving in with a bad roommate who doesn't pay, and then all of a sudden you're juggling bills and you're not saving, so you're not going to be able to move forward. Adaptively, you would move back to safety, where you can keep more resources for yourself rather than spend too many resources, because eventually what you're really doing is it might look like a move backward, but in terms of recentering, it's a move forward, because you're smart in terms of how am I best going to meet my needs.
You've also learned something along the way. So the next time you sign a lease on an apartment, you may be in better shape to do that.
Right.
Or who you choose to be your roommates.
Right.
Exactly.
And gaining world knowledge is certainly a way of taking care of yourself.
Yes.
Right? It's a way of meeting your needs. The more experience you have, the better you are to meet.
Well, I'm thinking particularly of parents, because as you well know, I have a couple of emerging adults in my life. And so I'm thinking in terms of the parent looking at the child, the emerging adult child, and saying, okay, well, I'm seeing progression, and I'm seeing regression, and I'm seeing progression. Kids do run into trouble, and I just wonder, how does one know the difference between the person on the track of recentering and maybe where they've gone off the rails?
Right.
What should parents be aware of or thinking about?
Yeah, this is definitely one of the hardest issues of dealing with an age period where you're expecting so much change, and when we say change is nonlinear and exploration's good, what is the benchmark? How can you measure it? You just don't know what is success and what is failure, and so what do you focus on? Really what you're focusing on is the individual becoming better at meeting his or her own needs, if you had to make an overall evaluation. And when you start to think about one role or another, like, is this person living on his or her own? Did she finish school? Did she get the job that we think that she should have? When you start to focus on these micro outcomes instead of the whole overall process, you can get stuck thinking there's competing information, right? Like, gosh, she's had 4 boyfriends, but she's had this job for 6 years. It's confusing. So look overall, like, what are her goals, and are they forward thinking? Is she able to meet them? And the other thing that's important to think about recentering and development is that when you look, let's just say emerging adulthood starts at age 18. Well, it's not as if everybody starts at the same place at age 18. There's a lot of variation in what happens between conception and age 18 that prepares people to recenter. So maybe it's not that they're having trouble recentering per se. Maybe it's not that maybe that's not where the root lies. The root is, from a developmental perspective, also put your focus and says you need to consider 2 things. What happened to this kid between conception and age 18 that prepared him or her to be able to recenter? And then you have to let yourself as a parent ask the question, was development on target before this kid hit 18? If development if you can let yourself fairly assess, if it wasn't necessarily on target before age 18, you're probably dealing with something that was an unmet need of the child before he reached 18. Now, this is where it gets complicated for parents, because they always think that if a child has an unmet need, it's saying that it's my fault, right? And that now this person's 21 and he should be responsible for himself. And then parents get in this bind of thinking, like, did I do something wrong or miss something?
Because he won't do his laundry.
Because he can't, yes, because he never has had a bank account. And this is how I try to think. There are many, many reasons why kids may have had they have missed a developmental milestone at some point. A lot of it happens because, there are several reasons that I think that the emerging adult lens is going to let us look at. I think that we miss a lot of learning issues in kids, and we're getting much better at diagnosis, childhood to adolescence, but we still know that almost 80% of child and adolescent disorders go undiagnosed and untreated. So, you get to emerging adulthood, is the problem something that happened when you're 21? And you're kind of confused, like, I'm not sure anything big happened in this kid's life. It's not as if we had a major episode or something that explains this. Then it's likely that it's something much more complex that maybe went unrecognized.
I'm wondering, because I'm aware that we're going to have to bring this to a close pretty soon, and I just wonder what advice you would give to parents who have an emerging adult, What advice would you give to me? What advice would you give to parents who have emerging adults on what's the best way to support them? Now, you've mentioned, one of the things you've mentioned is look at the big picture. Don't get over-focused on laundry. Don't get over-focused on, the ability to organize their college work or whatever. Look at the big picture. But are there other things that parents could be aware of in terms of supporting the emerging adult? And I don't mean just financially.
Right. I think that parents should look at their own expectations about how much responsibility they expect their child to have versus how much responsibility they think that society has for providing opportunities. The social contract is that you grow up into a society and that you join society and society takes care of you. Okay, that's the social contract that we all kind of believe in implicitly just by being members of our community. If your community isn't providing you with the opportunities, then it's not always just the individual. We live in an individualized state right now. We think that individuals have a lot of control over their lives. We perceive that individuals are responsible for their behavior. Mm-hmm. Versus like say the 1950s and 60s, society told you what to do. And it might have been oppressive, and certainly some groups suffered more than others. That's true. But individuals didn't feel that responsible necessarily for their choices. It was like, I'm going to be a secretary or teacher. I don't take it personally that I'm upset that I'm a secretary, mm-hmm. right? They don't feel like it was a bad choice on my part. I only had two choices, mm-hmm. right? And then now individuals have a lot more room to feel that they're responsible. And I think parents overly believe that their kids have more control than they do. Mm-hmm. But emerging adults are still, if you think of all adults, ages 18 to over 100, which group has the least power?
I can't answer that.
I think 18 to 29-year-olds, though there's good research to support this, but they have the least experience with the market. Mm-hmm. They have the least experience in the game. Mm-hmm. They have the fewest resources. They're if we thought of them, they're the least powerful. Mm-hmm. By the time you're in midlife, you're at the peak of your ability to amass resources and to use them as you want.
So you're also saying, not only look at the big picture, but look at the
big picture. They're just starting out, and they're not that powerful. Mm-hmm. It's not all them. Mm-hmm. We need to distribute a little bit of the explaining.
Because you're born in a cultural context.
That's right.
Yeah, in a historical context. Yeah. Dr. Tanner, thank you so much for spending this time with me. It's so interesting to hear you talk about this subject, and I'm really feel a lot of gratitude that you were able to do this today.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
All right, I'm looking forward to your presentation tomorrow.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
Thank you for joining us again for Keep Talking, a community dialogue about mental health, and I hope you'll be back again when the Brattleboro Retreat and Brattleboro Area Television join up together and do another one of these programs. Thanks so much for joining us.